A weirdly common problem in Final Fantasy XIV, possibly especially because of the age of the game combined with the amount of changes the game has got over the years, is that some players will claim that something is true without ever checking if it actually is. Either because they assumed it is the way they think, or because it was like that at some point. Welcome to Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, where I and my friends highlight the odd claims and misconceptions players make, and test them to see whether they are true or not, while also explaining how you can test it yourself so you can learn how to science stuff in Final Fantasy XIV. Number 1. Pets do noticeably less damage per potency than players. All pets in Final Fantasy XIV have their own stat lines and also scale unusually with buffs in real time, despite most of them being comparable to a glorified damage over time effect. Precisely how the pets scale with your stats can vary, but a rather common estimate is that pets do somewhere around 5/6 of the owner's damage and healing. While the exact difference can vary, it is very possible to demonstrate that pet potency exists and is not the same as player potency. Take any job with a pet of some sort, and take note of what potency it says that its attacks do. For a random example, take Summoner, who has a whole slew of pets. Summon Bahamut, which casts 4 worm waves in its duration, which each deal 150 potency of damage, or so they claim. Note how much damage they actually do, then use Pain Flare, which also claims to do 150 potency per target. Notice how Pain Flare does significantly more damage per target than Wormwave. Pet potency. Achmorn also does pet potency, making its impressive 1300 potency somewhat less impressive. A similar test can be performed for the 3 elemental primals, although we will need a bit of math for that one. They claim to do 750 potency to the primary target, so they should do 5 times more damage than Pain Flare. As you can see here, they clearly don't do that. On top of this, we can also observe that the damage they do, taking note of normal damage variance, is approximately 5/6 of the damage we originally expected. Number 2. Pets are like glorified dots and snapshot damage buffs. If temporary pets snapshot damage buffs, then you would be able to demonstrate this by observing how much damage the pet does without any damage buffs, how much it does with a certain damage buff, and then observe that the damage does not drop when the raid buff ends. Similarly, the pet's damage would not increase when the damage buff is applied in the middle of the pet's duration. A very real example of this that commonly comes up in the Summoner openers is that even if you cast Titan or Garuda while Searing Light is still up, if they don't manage to start their attack before it runs out, then they don't benefit from it. However, if temporary pets actually snapshotted buffs, then this wouldn't matter. Another, more easy to follow example is Astrologian's Earthly Star, which happens to function identically to pets, complete with pet potency. I know it is quite funny that Earthly Star is considered a pet. The damage of Earthly Star popping is directly tied to whether Divination or any other damage buffs for that matter are still up, regardless of whether they were up when the star was placed or when it amplified. Number 3. Sacred Soil and Passage of Arms interacts differently with dots than other damage reduction due to their unusual tooltips. To be clear, all damage reduction snapshots on dots, with the exception of block and parry, as you cannot block or parry damage over time. This means that if you use Rampart before a dot is applied to you, even if the dot outlasts Rampart, the entirety of the dot will do less damage. Similarly, if you use Rampart after a dot is applied to you, the dot's damage is unchanged. The suggestion somewhat stems from the fact that placed dot AoEs like Salted Earth scales real time with damage increasing debuffs on their targets, which we demonstrated in episode 2 of this series. However, this is not the same situation. We can demonstrate that these buffs like Sacred Soil works exactly like any other damage reduction by receiving a random dot and noting how much damage it does. Then receiving it again and applying Sacred Soil afterwards and observing that the damage is unchanged. We can also observe that the damage reduction is snapshotted by applying Sacred Soil and then receiving the dot, and noting that the damage is reduced for the entirety of the dot, regardless of Sacred Soil. We can safely assume that Passage of Arms works the same way, as it is technically also a placed AoE that reduces damage taken, so I will leave that as an exercise for the viewer. Number 4. Physis II's healing bonus affects itself. The tooltip does actually do a good job of explaining this indirectly. The buffs are applied in the order they are listed. The heart is mentioned first and the healing bonus second, so it makes sense that they don't interact. To test this, our best example would be to use Cradle and noting how much it heals for. If Physis II is affected by its own healing bonus, then it should heal for a clear 43% more than Cradle. However, if it isn't affected, it will instead only heal for 30% more. We can see here that Cradle heals for around 2.95k per tick in my equipment. This means that if Physis II is affected by its own bonus, it should at least heal consistently for over 4.1k, and if not, around 3.8k, which is what we observe here. And now for a rather long one. Number 5. The Garuda First Opener is better with 2 jobs with short duration raid buffs. This one I was initially made aware of by a question from Yisu of our community here. The origin of this claim is The Balance's Discord, which suggests this as an optimal opener with this exact assumption. The more specific detail of the claim is that if you have 2 jobs from the list, Bard, Monk, Reaper, Astrologian or Dragoon, in your raid, then the Garuda First Opener is superior. It turns out this is not completely true, but this turns out to be a well-known topic in the deeper sections of the Summoner optimizing community, which I'm sure some of you might be shocked exists given the kinds of comments I see on Summoner guides. You know who you are. Summoner has 2 common openers, the Titan into Garuda opener, commonly known as simply Titan First, and the Garuda into Titan opener, commonly known as simply Garuda First. Titan happens to have the greatest total potency of the 3 summons, but Garuda has the most front-loaded potency of the 3 due to Slipstream. Obviously, once your damage buffs runs out, it makes no difference which order you use your attacks in, so the decision is entirely down to fitting the most potency in the time frame where your damage is boosted. A key weakness of Slipstream, however, is that its dot component does not snapshot debuffs on the target, making it incapable of benefiting fully from effects like Chain Stratagem or Mug. We demonstrated this interaction in episode 2 of this series using Salted Earth. This is also why it is important which jobs actually count for the original claim. Both of the openers, and honestly any optimized opener you could possibly come up with for Summoner, would always start with Ruin 3 into Bahamut, with the majority of the burst front-loaded right after raid buffs come out. But these 2 openers, and potentially any other optimized opener you could come up with, would split paths after Bahamut leaves. What makes these 2 openers different is that Titan First, of course, starts with Titan, and Garuda First starts with Garuda. The significance of this difference is that Titan has the greater total potency, meaning it can provide more value from longer raid buffs, while Garuda's slightly more front-loaded damage of Slipstream allows it to sneak in more damage before shorter raid buffs end. A common pitfall in calculating these 2 against each other is forgetting that you need to compare them from the moment they start deviating from each other and until they pair up again, once you cast Ifrit, even if raid buffs are long gone before then. Another common pitfall is that you might be estimating how many buffs Garuda First would need to beat Titan, but not actually remembering to add them to the Titan First opener as well. Remember, you're choosing between them. And the third pitfall is in relation to pet mechanics and pet potencies, which can cause calculations to be incorrect. In Final Fantasy XIV Mythbusters, I prefer to calculate things by potency, and then we can always see exactly what the difference is between them, so we know how many damage buffs we need, rather than try and calculate it practically. Don't worry, if you aren't a big math nerd, I will try to spell it out so everyone can keep up. With that said, it's math time! Now, some assumptions. First, the slowest build for optimizing Summoner has a GCD of 2.48, so we will assume that. Second, pet potencies can be complicated, but it is relatively common, as I mentioned earlier, that they are around 5/6 of a player's potency, so we will simply assume that. The attacks Titan and Garuda themselves cast are thus closer to 625 potency rather than 750 as listed. This would similarly matter to calculate for Bahamut, if not for the simple fact that that part is identical between the 2 openers, so it wouldn't change anything for calculations. And finally, for the third assumption, we are using these openers to demonstrate, and we assume that raid buffs are up by 7 seconds generally. Certain buffs like Arcane Circle commonly come out a bit sooner, but for the sake of this comparison, that is not important, as this lands in the Bahamut part of the opener anyway. A crucial detail between the two openers is that the Garuda First Opener can sneak in Titan in time for Searing Light to cover it too, but the Titan First Opener cannot sneak in Garuda in time. This is because the pets use their actions slightly after they're summoned, so it doesn't matter whether you have the buff in time. This might sound like a minimal detail, but it does actually make a huge difference, which I learned myself during calculations. Now, both openers can be split up into 5 parts. The Bahamut bit, which we will just throw out. The short buff bit, which is around 2 GCDs. The Searing Light bit, which varies slightly between them. And the Tincture bit. Naturally, the Tincture bit covers all of the relevant parts of the Searing Light and short buff bits. And Searing Light covers all of the short buff bit. And finally, there is the tail end, which has no buffs and is the part of the rotation before both openers use Ifrit. Now, what makes this comparison so interesting is that, essentially, the Garuda First Opener scales better with shorter rate buffs, and even in some capacity with Searing Light when everything goes perfectly. That means, of course, that if Searing Light is not properly late weaved, or is used 1 GCD late, or any other rate buff is used at an unusual time, then Titan First ends up winning anyway. Add to this that Titan First scales almost as well as Garuda First with the short duration buffs, and also scales better with the few longer duration buffs there are, which I will not be covering much. And Titan already appears to be the consistently safer choice. Given this huge build-up, I imagine you think that the power difference between these two openers must be astronomical, right? Well, to be clear, if you just use late-weaved Searing Light, then Garuda First is about 0.1% better than Titan First. But if you then add a Tincture, then Titan First is around 0.6% better than Garuda First, because Titan shoves more potency into the 30-second long Tincture window. But because Garuda First shoves slightly more potency into the short duration rate buff window, adding these rate buffs tends to give Garuda a way to catch up again. I think it is also worthwhile to mention that Garuda First only has the advantage without Tinctures if everything is done perfectly, as delaying Searing Light 1 GCD shifts the advantage back to Titan, and if any rate buffs come out too soon, then Slipstream won't benefit, and too late and Titan will benefit more. In other words, by default, Titan First is better if your group isn't perfect, or if you have any not short rate buffs other than Searing Light, or you use a Tincture. In the opener, and often in the 6-minute burst, it is common to make use of a Tincture. Optimally geared, these tend to grant 7 to 8% more damage output in their duration, leaning closer to 8% than 7%, and this gives the Titan First Opener a huge advantage due to the duration of this buff. If, hypothetically, we assume that it is 7% to be slightly in favor of the Garuda First Opener, then you actually need at least 20% more damage done from short duration rate buffs for Garuda First to break even with Titan First. 24% if Tinctures granted 8% more damage. And this is where the problems arrive, because obviously you can't do that with just 2 buffs. You need 4 at least. And they need to be 5% each, which means you can't just bring any 2 of those 5 jobs to make that happen. You may need more, and depending on how many you have, you may need them to not only give rate buffs, but specifically give their personal buffs, like cards, to you. Notably, this discussion is typically only about 15-second rate buffs, or rate buffs like Arcane Circle that get used earlier, leading to the same end timing. Because longer buffs, like Dancer's technical finish, tends to tip in favor of Titan First, so much that it might not actually be relevant for this discussion. So to summarize for those that perhaps found it a bit too mathematically intense, my findings are as follows. If you're using a Tincture, like in the opener or 6 minutes in, you need at least 4 short duration rate buffs with around 5% or more damage bonus each for Garuda First to even be worth considering. If you are not using a Tincture, then you need at least 2 short duration rate buffs for Garuda First to be even worth considering. All other cases, Titan First wins. And that also means for the players that don't do much coordinated savage raiding and the like, that you are probably best served by just exclusively using the Titan First Opener. On a final note, I want to highlight that I did not concern myself with how other raid buffs would impact the results, because the original claim didn't either. However, it is possible that longer buffs like Technical Finish would tip further in favor of Titan First, in terms of how many buffs you'd need to make Garuda First worth it. Ultimately, when you have an optimized group, you would probably only really concern yourself with Garuda First if you have an unusually large amount of short duration buffs. As otherwise, both openers pretty much break even anyway, with a tendency for Titan First to be superior. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, if you have an Astrologian in your group, that probably does card bursts, leading to a single card on the odd minute. If the card is played exactly 1 minute after raid buffs on a summoner, then Garuda First would be superior to use after Phoenix, due to the lack of Searing Light and Tinctures to enhance the Titan First sequence.